Welcome, everybody. I'd like to say thank you for coming tonight to 1014 on Fifth Avenue for another one of our lovely events as part of the series Humanities for Humans. My name is Katja Donovan. I'm the Executive Director here at 1014. We're a space for ideas. And if you would like to know more about us or about this house, there are some brochures downstairs, so please let me know and I'll hand you one. I'm not going to take up too much of your time sort of to talk about us, because this is about the topic tonight. And I'm very grateful to Irene Kacandes, who not only came up with the idea of the series Humanities for Humans and curated it, but also, of course, organized tonight's event, is going to moderate tonight's event. Irene is a board member of 1014, a very dear friend, and very grateful that she took this on together with the Gruyter Foundation. So here we go, and I'll pass it on to Myrto from the Gruyter Foundation.
Good evening. As Katja said, I am Myrto Aspiotti. I'm an acquisitions editor for literature and culture at De Gruyter, and I'm here today representing the De Gruyter Foundation, which is a not-for-profit founded by our press that supports researchers in the humanities and social sciences. For those of you who don't know us yet, De Gruyter is one of Europe's foremost independent academic presses. We are headquartered in Berlin and Boston, and we've been working to build transatlantic ties in research and publishing since we first opened our New York office in the early 1970s. The humanities are by far the strongest area of our publishing program, and there is good reason for that. We know the value of the humanities in advancing social discourse about the big questions in our lives and communities, and we are committed to doing all we can as a publisher to support researchers in the humanities in these trying times. In the face of current conflicts and social divisions, nationally and internationally, the humanities remain a space for nuanced conversation and debate. This is why, in setting up this series of events, together with our partners at 1014, we privilege the format of the dialogue over that of a lecture or a seminar. We have been delighted by how Humanities for Humans has been received so far, and we hope that by the end of the second year of the series life, which is just beginning tonight, we can publish an edited volume with contributions by the wonderful guests that have made this series what it is. We cannot thank them enough for their time and the energy they put into the series, and we are ever grateful to our partners at 1014 for the space, the resources, and the work they put in to make these events possible. And above all, we want to thank Irene Kacandes, not only for her role in conceptualizing the series and inviting an incredible lineup of speakers, but for always going above and beyond in her role as moderator of these often demanding and complex conversations. Thank you, Irene, and I'll pass the floor to you.
I want to thank you so much, Myrto, and thank you, Katja, and all the people associated with 1014 and with De Gruyter. These organizations really leapt at this idea of mine, and it's been very satisfying. I also want to mention there's a board, and I thank the members of the board, as well as the first season speakers, and of course tonight's speakers, and those that are going to come up in season 2, which I'll announce at the end of our time together. I actually want to thank each and every one of you in the audience as well, because first of all, so many wonderful things happen in New York City, and it's hard to decide what to go to on a given night. So thank you for being here. But also thank you by your presence for your support of the humanities. I don't need to tell you that we're living through a particularly horrendous stage in the lives of humans and the humanities. Wars, climate change have taken lives and caused millions of people to be on the run, more than at any other point in recorded human history. On some level, I ask myself, how dare we come together tonight to talk about gender, desire, embodiment? And on the other hand, I say to myself, how dare we not talk about these issues? In proposing this series, I wanted to bring humanities and the general public together because humanities fields are under attack in this country and in other places in the world, like Great Britain. Whole departments are being eliminated by college administrations, and enrollments in humanities classes, unfortunately, are mostly declining. The humanities, as we're considering them in this series, include a very large range of fields that study the arts, literature, music, philosophy, religion, and of course humans who create and participate in those things. In a sense, we could say that humanities scholars have posed questions and developed methods and concepts to help us better understand human behavior, organization, creativity in the past and the present. Precise verbal expression orally and in writing are what I consider hallmarks of the humanities fields. As teachers, we strive to help our students learn how to think, not what to think, and how to then best express their thoughts. Some of you will know that in Germany and other places, there's a strong tradition of humanities scholars as public intellectuals who are given space to share their views in venues like print journalism and radio. That's not been so much the case here in the United States. So one goal of this series has been simply to give airtime to some really smart and interesting people, two of whom you have before you tonight. To be sure, another goal has been to discuss some concepts coming out of the humanities that have been accidentally or unfortunately sometimes intentionally misrepresented to the general public. Welcome, and please don't feel shy, just sit anywhere you find an open seat, okay? Some of you will know that the topics we took up last year included terms we could put into a category of misrepresented concepts that come out of academia: racism, fascism, climate change, systemic inequality, repair, reparation, refusal. The terms gender and transgender, too, have passed into the public sphere in some ways that did not and do not reflect the analytical work that academics coined these terms to do. Another observation of mine over many years has been that maybe academics have been spending too much time talking to each other and not enough explaining themselves to the general public. So we're calling these gatherings conversations not just because there are two experts sitting here who will exchange ideas with each other, but also because we want this to be a conversation with you. And there will be time before we conclude to hear from you on these subjects. In setting the tone for tonight's discussion, I'm going to share that when I first started to teach, and as you can see, that's a long time ago, gender was almost exclusively used as a grammatical term. French has masculine and feminine, German and Greek have masculine, feminine, and neuter, for instance. And it sure was hard to get my students to incorporate that into their attempts at speaking the new language. A new meaning came into view in the academy through second-wave feminism, gender as a kind of code word for turning attention to and recuperating women's voices, women authors, women figures. To be sure, this was a worthwhile endeavor, but it was a diminishment of the potential of gender to consider how women's and men's roles were socially constructed and how gender roles combine with other aspects of identity, such as age, race, and class, to produce interlocking oppressions. Concepts that spread and developed especially after the work of the Combahee River Collective in 1970s, after Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term intersectionalities in 1989, and Shirley Judith Butler's gender trouble in 1990. What might the term gender be now? Well, I'm going to leave that mainly to the experts, but I want to quote for you Masha Gessen's formulation that, quote, "Gender is something that happens between me and other people." I really like that, so please indulge me, as my students sometimes do, for repeating. Gender is something that happens between me and other people, end of quote. If you watch TV, read the newspaper, look at the internet, you will have detected a lot of animus currently being attached to the very words gender and transgender. Some have decided that gender is a threat to national security. Tonight, my friends, we're not going to take that on directly, at least not at first. Rather, our two speakers are inviting us to go on a different kind of journey, a journey where our collective vehicle on that journey might be desire. Sounds good, right? So without further ado, let me please introduce our speakers. Jack Halberstam is director of the Institute for Research on Women, Gender, and Sexuality at Columbia University, where he also holds the David Feinstein Professorship of Humanities. He's the author of numerous books and articles, as well as a committed participant in conversations between academics and the general public. This is not your first rodeo, right? And I'll mention that on this reading list that you will have found, we have only a few of Jack's books. He's written many more, so please have a look. When Jack was appointed to his full professorship at Columbia University, he stated, quote, "I hope that my particular weird mix of irreverence, silliness, eclecticism, and queer commitment will impact upon my colleagues and students." I have a lot of buddies at Columbia, and they all affirm that Jack has certainly had a profound impact on his colleagues and students. Welcome, Jack. It's so great to be here. Meg Fernandes, on my far right, is Associate Professor of English and Writer-in-Residence at Lafayette College. Meg's the author of 3 books of poetry. Herself born in Canada, she was raised in the Philly area and is currently residing in New York City. Her family are East African Goans. The Rumpus has called her, quote, "a blunt truth teller and measured verse architect," end of quote. I had the privilege of hearing Meg read recently at a poetry event in Berlin, Germany, and was completely wowed and affirmed that assessment. I've been thrilled by every one of our series guests, but I hope you'll join me in giving a particularly warm welcome to Meg as a practicing poet. The world needs more poets, and certainly more talented and fun ones like Meg. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to ask our 2 visitors, guests, expert speakers, where does your mind go when you think of these 3 words that we decided to give as a title for this event? Gender, desire, embodiment. And Meg, I think you're willing to launch us?
Hi, you can hear me? Okay. Yes, very blunt. My mother says it's not my best quality. So, first of all, thank you so much, Irene, and thank you, Jack. Thank you all for coming out here. I'm actually going to start today by reading a poem. And the poem is about a filmmaker who's on the list that you should see. So under films, it's Madsen Minax. It's a short film called Bigger on the Inside. I met Madsen at Yaddo, which is a writing residency, like it's an artist residency. They were working on this film, and it's basically a short film about them looking through a telescope. And then it becomes about fisting, and it becomes about orifices, and it becomes a kind of queer, a very artistic, like queer smut film. And they make a lot of queer smut films. And at one point I was like, "What's your thing with smut?" And they're like, "Meg, it's not smut, it's a love story." And I loved that. And I've been thinking about that. So I wrote this poem. And the only other thing you need to know for this is that Frank O'Hara, who's a New York City poet. How many of you nod if you've heard of Frank O'Hara? If you haven't, you should. And he has a quote that says, "All I want is boundless love." So I'm going to talk a little bit about that afterwards, talk about a few things, and then hand it over to Jack. So this poem is called "I'm Smarter Than This." I'm going to stand up. Is that okay? I'm just used to, I'm going to start walking around like I'm doing a comedy special like this. Okay. It's called "I'm Smarter Than This Feeling, But Am I?" I watch your film about fisting. Orifice as cave, as grave, as starlit wormhole dug in space. You're obsessed by interiority, by the drunk shipwreck of it, by our inside rivers so alien, we might as well call them Sweden or Pluto or 1973, and what's the difference? All of them are out of reach. I know we're both smarter than this feeling because we've talked about desire and her little games. I cry easily as I watch your old school. You want what O'Hara wanted, I think, which is a kind of boundlessness that won't kill anyone, edging. You don't believe in bodies. Everyone is dust, condensed by circumstances. You see what I was before I was a was and am. What's your thing with smut, I ask. You say it's not smut. It's a love story. To be taken apart is as important as being put together. Near annihilation reminds you of a limit, and ask yourself, who do you trust at your limit? At a party last night in Chinatown, I invent you walking through the door. It is warm and I smoke a cigarette on the balcony. Everyone is a producer and talking about Kathy Acker, and what would I say if I could? That I want our years to keep meeting. I don't want 1973 or a failed planet or even Sweden. Instead of saying this, I ask about your film. We put the art between us because the art exists and we do not. This is called sublimation. We puppet our meat in the gray twilight of the real world, and I pretend I'm not speaking to time. So, thank you. Yeah. First of all, we had a choice of we wanted a handheld mic or a lapel mic, and I'm kind of jealous of yours now, Irene. I saw it.
You can have it.
So I chose this poem to begin because I think this brings up two things related to the topics that we're talking about today. The first is interiority, right? And I think when we are talking a lot about like queer and trans bodies, we're really kind of obsessed with this sort of almost like phenotypic, fetishistic, like, is the body intelligible as trans, as queer, as cis? And that kind of focus, always on the outside of the body, really misses a big part of, at least when I was coming up in queer studies, which was a commitment to ambiguity and to things that one could not know, things that were sort of subperceptual to us. And my first degree, and Jack and I are going to talk about this, I think maybe a little bit about like chemistry. My first degree is in like actually molecular biology, and I spent a lot of time in like a lab looking at like mRNA transcripts and thinking about how easy it is when you're in those spaces to think of the body as something that is denaturalized, right? So thinking about the body not as something that is biologically deterministic, thinking about like interiority is a really important under-theorized way of looking at queer and trans like discourse right now, especially in like sort of the public eye, which is obsessed with what people can see, with the body as evidence, what people can kind of prove, right? So that poem to me was like, okay, we're looking inside all the time. We're looking literally in a telescope. Obviously, it opens with fisting. The New Yorker didn't take this poem. I don't know why. That was great. Took another poem, but, not to flex, but like, but also like it opens with this idea of the orifice, which brings me to my second point, which is like, I think of this quote from Donna Haraway, who says, sex, infection, and eating are old relatives. Because according to Haraway, there's this idea that it's the moment in which you become in relation to somebody. You eat the apple, you are the apple. You get the virus, you surrender to the virus. You have sex with someone, you're in relation with them, you are at risk to surrender to them. And all of a sudden, there are these moments in which you become a distributed subject. You're no longer a kind of sovereign subject. You're not just on your own. You're sort of part of something that's more relational, which is what desire is. Desire, and I think that quote that you brought up of Masha's was great, which is like, my gender is really produced by who I'm in the room with, right? And desire is a kind of triangulating sort of structure, right? You can't want what you already have. It's always you, what you want, and that sort of obstacle in between. So boundlessness, orifices, interiority, and as you can tell, Jack and I think, are really committed to having a conversation of poetics about trans and queerness, because good poets know that language is just a failure, right? So any ways that we can sort of destabilize, I think those ideas are where we would like to begin. I think so. I'm just speaking for you right now, but yeah, go ahead. Your turn.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Good evening. Thank you to Irene for convening us, and to Meg, who is my ideal interlocutor. You can see when we're asked, like, how did we get to these topics of gender, desire, and embodiment, she went straight to fisting. And I think that's why I thought, let's get Meg in here to cut through any of the niceties and start talking about what's really at stake. So I love that poem so much, and we'll dig into that in a moment. Let me just put out some topics that are sort of under the spotlight and under discussion in this very fraught moment, at a time when people are very polarized about all kinds of things, and then play it out in their relationship to issues like transgender bodies, where they can go, where they should not go, how we should think about the bathroom, what kind of space should it be, who should be in there, and so on. So I want to get into questions about why we are so focused on trans-affirming care for trans youth at this moment when we clearly have much bigger problems to be worrying about, and yet we have conservative politicians who are doing their very best to try to make sure that young people who want to transition will be prevented from doing so. So I think let's see if we can figure out the answer, and I have a few answers to those questions. Let me say also, though, as somebody who is a slightly different generation than Meg, that just a little bit, that it's been really interesting to watch how these conversations about gender and desire have evolved over the past 2 decades. We're in a moment when there are young people, for example, who really believe in something called gender abolition. The idea that gender is an oppressive construct and that we should maybe stop using it. That's hard for me because I grew up in a time when gender styles were a way of signaling your queerness to other people who might not openly be able to talk about that. And so in a lot of queer, what were then called lesbian communities, people used butch femme styles, right, to indicate their desire, not just their gender, but also their desire. And that was seen as sort of anachronistic, an old way of doing things until, and Irene mentioned this, until Judith Butler came out with these 2 amazing books, Gender Trouble and Bodies That Matter. And the reason that those books were so sort of world-shifting is because Butler took the emphasis off of queer and trans people and put it on straight people. Butler said, gender, isn't simply a pathology when we see how it's acted out through queer bodies. Gender is a problem for all bodies. All bodies, they said, are performing their gender. And this was received, very poorly by all kinds of people, but it's proven to be a very powerful formulation and one that we continue to use today. So I want to hold on to the possibility that gender, which seems to be a way of limiting our options, is also gives us access to desire, might not be something that we want to dull with androgyny and the abolition of gender. And that's something that we can maybe talk about because Meg's poems are really, they bristle with all kinds of desire that come from gendered locations. So I'm going to hold on to gender, not simply because I think it's important to differentiate between male and female bodies, but because it gives us access to desire. Second thing that we maybe could discuss is feminism. And I won't say too much about that right now, but some people have proposed, and I think this plays out in some of Meg's poems. For some people, feminism is a place where we should be talking about gender and its politics. And for other people, like, for example, Gail Rubin, who is an anthropologist of sexuality, feminism has been a very bad place to talk about sexuality because there have been moral projects that have resided within feminism that in some cases have joined forces, like, say, anti-pornography in the 1980s and 90s, have joined forces with conservative groups and made it very difficult to talk in explicit ways about sexuality. So feminism, question mark. That takes me to my third point. What's with the incredible skirmishes that we see, particularly online nowadays, between trans women and the people who are being called trans-exclusionary radical feminists? For those of you who are interested, there's a great sci-fi novel called Manhunt by Gretchen Volker Martin. Maybe at least one person in the room has read it apart from me. Has anybody else read it? Wow, okay.
Take your time and tell us about it.
It's a great novel. It's in the near future, and there's been an apocalypse. And in that apocalypse, hormones are the vehicles of mutant transformations. And so people with testosterone have transformed into feral animals. People with estrogen are now in danger from these feral men, but they are also somewhat in control of the human population. We're introduced to a group of trans women who hunt down feral men in order to extract hormones from their testes so that they can make artificial estrogen in order to remain women. Okay, so that's our plot. In the meanwhile, in the background, women are running the world, but there's a faction of women who are trans-exclusionary radical feminists who want to hunt down trans women. Okay, so that's, here we are, post-apocalypse, TERFs are running things out of Boston, Massachusetts. Feral men are on the rampage, and there are a few trans men and a few trans women trying to survive. That's why it's called Manhunt. I love the novel. It's super gory, it's super violent. I really recommend it. But I do take exception to the idea that our biggest danger in the near future are going to be these wacko women who don't call themselves radical feminists. We tend to attach this label to them, trans-exclusionary radical feminists. They're not feminists, they're not radical. They're mostly women who are part of parent groups, who are worried about trans women in the bathrooms, or worried about their children being contaminated by new ideas of gender flexibility and fluidity. That's who they are. We should not call them feminists, because when we do, we muddy the waters of feminism and make it very difficult then to have alliances between trans people fighting conservatives and reproductive rights people fighting conservatives, often over the same issues. Okay? So that's a topic I would be interested in discussing. Then I'll end by saying, well, what is it that conservatives are so worried about in relationship to trans youth and increasingly non-binary youth? I'll tell you what they're worried about. They're worried that in this day and age, some 20% of young people identify as non-binary. 20%. That's a lot. Okay, now when you add something like 10% identify as gay and lesbian, and another 8% identify as trans, we're close to 40% of the young population not identifying as normatively gender or heterosexual in any uncomplicated way. That's what conservatives are worried about. Not because the threat to gender stability is out there, but because it's in their own homes. And there are multiple people who are authoring anti-trans bills in Oklahoma, in Colorado, in Texas, who have trans and non-binary children. And that's where they're hurting. Because the very project that they have tried to pass on to their kids is being undone in their own household. So to those people, and to some trans people who are anti-non-binary, I want to explain non-binary to you in these terms. Okay, so, a lot of people ask me, well, what do you think about non-binary? Why are so many people identifying as non-binary? What does it even mean? It seems to cover such a vast array of identifications. What it actually means is something bigger than a non-stable gender identification. What I think we have to pay attention to in non-binary is the non. The young, this massive swathe of young people who have found refuge in that term are not only saying no to gender, they're saying no to the entire system that is being handed on to them, that is corrupt, that is failed, that is lousy, that is exploitative, extractive, and so on. So when someone says they're non-binary, I think they're saying, yes, something about the surface of the body, but they're saying something much bigger than that. They're saying no to this shitty world that older generations are passing on to them. And for that reason, it's wrong to sort of take a stand against non-binary, as some trans theorists have done. Kaji Amin is one example of that. And it's wrong of legislators to even think that they can legislate this out of existence. That's not going to happen. This is a whole generation of people who are deeply comfortable with gender flexibility and who have no intention at all of going back to this very rigid setup of heterosexual gender normativity. So that's just to put some
Absolutely.
definitions on the
No,
table.
you both have put so much out there for us to think about. I do want to pick up on your last point, Jack, just because I think we can make a bridge to the issue. It's precisely parallel to climate disaster, right? The idea that these generations before us weren't paying attention. They created this world, they're passing it on to us, and we have this horrible, horrible challenge in front of us of just existing, right? So I think it's very helpful for you to share with us this idea that that non-binary is not just a rejection of male, female straitjackets, but it's saying much more about the system that's being handed to people.
Yeah, that was sort of important for me to get to, because when I published my trans book, I would go around with it, and a young person in a college audience one day said, well, what about non-binary? And I was like, yeah, no, I don't think so. Because what does that even mean? Non-binary is in a binary. It's in a binary with a binary. Like, what's the point of this? And I was just like, yeah, no. You're just trying to avoid saying something about who you are. You're saying what you're not. That's a very confusing thing to do, to say I am not X, as opposed to I am X. And so I immediately kind of rejected it out of hand. And I feel like I've had to be schooled, you know. And that's part of what it means to get a bit older, is to realize you don't necessarily have a monopoly on these knowledges, and things have changed. And people mean something else by the category that they're explaining to you. And I'm good with that. I want to hear more about it, and I want to understand it better. But the reason that I did, in a way, push back on it was for the thing that I started with, which is that gender for me is important as a foundation for desire. So I personally wouldn't call myself non-binary.
Great. So let me bring something together that each of you said also as just a next place to go, because you used the word contamination, right? The fear of contamination. And I'd like to bring that, I think it's going to be complicated, but you two can handle this. I want to bring that into dialogue with what Meg said about interiority, right? So where's the contamination, right? How do those two phenomena that are kind of in this complex, how do they work together or work against each other or feed off each other?
Yeah, I actually thought it was interesting that you were bringing up a lot of science studies terms. Like, there was something about, like, I mean, obviously you're talking about a post-apocalyptic world where mutation, and I think when people hear the word trans, they're already thinking about something like a kind of transgenic discourse, right? That there's this fear of a sort of recombination or some kind of uncanny valley. You'll be able to recognize the person you know, but then there's going to be something that is going to cause a disidentification. And so to me, that kind of goes well with what you brought up about that this has something to do with climate change and climate disaster, which is always about the future, right? So part of what Jack was saying was like the fear is about a kind of non-reproductive futurity. Climate disaster is about a futurity that maybe cannot also exist, but we're sort of stuck in this moment where we're trying to almost, you know, I read this book recently on like cryopolitics, which is basically about like governments who caused the genocide of indigenous people now wanting to freeze the genetic material of the people that they caused the genocide of. And so this sort of laid out like a foundation for thinking about what is it in us that wants to preserve something at the moment where we're also causing its extinction, right? And so, and it's almost like this breaking apart of kind of cause and effect. But I think that actually something that's always the shadow discourse of queer and trans studies is this kind of scientific, right, biological understanding of what bodies are supposed to do, right? And so a contamination of that is a threat literally to the species, right? I always say to my students, whenever we're talking about species in class, we're really just talking actually about gender, desire, sexuality, and like race. We're talking about threats to a kind of future that can be legislated. And so also to go back to your point about the non and the non-binary, the non-ness is that which you can't legislate because you don't know what it means. And what it means is different for every person, right? And by the way, like I'm not, I'm a poet. I feel like I should just keep saying this. Like I don't have necessarily at the kind of like trajectory as expert as Jack in these studies. And when I was talking to Irene, I was like, so I'm just going to come up here and talk a lot of anecdotes about like my sex life, and then like we'll do that. And we decided not to go that route. But I do think it's important to bring up that one way in which bodies have knowledges that are queer are these kind of interior private knowledges that you have when you have to learn about another person's body or your own body that what is nowhere in the culture. Mm-hmm. So, it's like, this is what you call this part of my body, right? Everything becomes discursive. And at that moment, when you put into language what this thing is supposed to mean to this one person that is not reproducible in any other person, you realize it reflects back something about heterosexual culture, right?
If I could just interject really quickly, I had the privilege of hearing Kent Monkman speak the other day, and I was really taken with a project where he was trying to find the Cree words for certain things. And he looked for a word for the sexual phenomenon of not being male or female, which was very powerful in his culture. And he kept asking the elders, so what's the word they used for that? What's the word they used for it? And they looked at him with a lot of blank looks, because it turns out there's no Cree word for it. It was just understood. It was just accepted. They didn't need to label it. And I thought that was really fascinating, right? There's no word for this non-female, non-male, embodiment of desires, right? It's just there, so they don't need to even name it, right? It's kind of the inverse of the language problem. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, for those of you who don't know, Kent Monkman is a Swampy Cree First Nations artist from Canada, and he paints, you can see across, I think it's the Met, there's two beautiful, huge, large-scale paintings by him that are often based upon a canonical American painting, of Washington crossing the Delaware or whatever, but is recast as a kind of anti-colonial arrival narrative. And it's, helping the newcomers to shore as opposed to sort of pushing immigrants back by building a wall or something. But in all of his paintings, there are non-gender specific bodies. And it's really interesting to me how he manages to depict non-specific gender, because it's very difficult to capture gender ambiguity in paint unless you paint the naked body. And he does. He often paints the naked body with, there'll be a trans man who has a male torso and facial hair, but no male genitalia, for example. And that forces you to reevaluate the cosmology within which he's working. And when you reevaluate it, everything's reevaluated, not just the gender of the players, but even the nature of the colonial encounter. So that's, it's an amazing universe that comes alive through his work.
Yeah, I was just going to add that one of the great things about Monkman is also, like, there will be, like, an oar from, like, a ship, from, like, when ships were a thing, like, I don't know, like 18, whatever. And then there will be, like, a cell phone. So there's something there also with, like, disturbing time, space that I think actually is related to what we're talking about, like, what are queer and trans temporalities. A lot of my friends who are transitioning or have transitioned talk about their second puberties, right, that they're having, or, like, having queer adolescence in your 30s. Because you didn't do the things that you thought you were going to do in your 20s because maybe you weren't out then, or maybe you didn't identify a certain way then. So I think that also, like, destabilization of, like, time is not something that is marked by sort of colonial modernity, which is something that I think he's doing. There's this kind of radical thing that is also part of, like, these gender discourses and these sexuality discourses, which is, like, I'm disturbing the life stage of heterosexual trajectories. It's not going to be like we meet, we marry, we have kids, wealth accumulation, we die. Not that everybody does that, but, like, it's really encouraged, Yeah.
To go to the question about interiority that Meg beautifully laid out for us, and then you had this great quote from Donna Haraway about the interaction of sex, infection, and eating. I mean, I think this is a really nice way to also get at kind of contrary understandings of gender. We're so fixated, as Meg was saying, on the exterior of the body, and particularly on the idea of what the genitalia look like, when we often are in a room where we don't know what the genitalia of other people looks like, and yet we've made all kinds of gender attributions anyway. And I feel like, Meg, in that poem that you read, you're trying to move us off of that and remind us that the body actually has an interior that is, and I think it's in the language of the poem, bigger than you might expect. But it's also the fact that it's in the internal functions of the body that transition happens, as you were saying. Like when you introduce a hormone into the body, if a trans man is taking testosterone or a trans woman is taking estrogen, yeah, you can see the impact of those changes on the external layer of the body, but the changes are actually interior. And there is a theorist who's on your reading list, Paul Preciado, who wrote a book called Testo Junkie. And it elaborates what he calls a pharmacopornographic theory of embodiment. And again, like Butler, he refuses to just make the story be about trans people. He says, in fact, that we are all governed now by the pharmaco, right? So, in fact, the gendered body is a system of relations between excitement and detumescence and frustration and so on. And all of those things are tended to by pharmaceuticals. So it's not just trans people who take estrogen and testosterone who are on drugs. The whole population is on drugs of one kind or another. Think of your own medication lists here for a minute. In other words, the transformation of the body that we're currently inhabiting, says Preciado, is molecular. Mm-hmm. It's not morphological. It's not on the outside. And we're all doing it. Right? So when you go to the doctor, he doesn't say, let me press on your body. Let me see if I can move this back into place. He says, okay, take Zoloft. Here, take this pill. Take that pill. Oh, you have pain, take another pill. That's medicine. But that wasn't medicine 20 years ago. Okay? So similarly, we are treating gender with these chemical supplements as we are treating everything. It's no different.
Yeah. Do you have another question, or I might turn it to something?
Go. I've got tons of questions, but I'd love to hear your questions.
Yeah, I was just, thinking about, I'm going to go straight into the anecdotal, like a conversation I had with a friend recently who wanted to get breast reduction surgery and wanted to get her surgery covered by insurance, and a lot of factors have to go into that. And one of them that she told me that was really wild is that after you do the surgery and afterwards they weigh literally what they took off, and it has to be a certain percentage of your body weight in order for your insurance to cover it. And I was just like, she's writing an essay about it. She's got like a pretty good book deal. But I was like, that is literally like a pound of flesh. I mean, I don't know actually, but like there was something about the literalness of it. And then we were talking about like our other friend who had top surgery and like how these things, like even the surgical kind of discourse of like what it means to change your body, like everybody is changing their body, right? But there is something about the morphological, I forgot that Preciado used that, like that seems so like quantifiable. Like how do we quantify the body? How do we quantify gender? What makes it, and what level of how much at risk do you have to be for death? Because all of this has a precarity and proximity. All queerness has like an erotics of death, like, And so how close do you have to be to death, like getting breast cancer that could potentially kill you, for like an insurance company to like cover that surgery, right? And it's a lot of genetic factors. You have to go to a genetic counselor, et cetera. I just thought that was interesting. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's a bunch of different places we could go. It sounded like maybe you had a particular segue.
Well, I just knew that Meg and I had both gone to see Paul Preciado's film last week at the New York Film Festival, which is called Orlando, and it came from the fact that this film company in France said, we want to make a biography of you. And he said, oh, hell no. But if you give me all the resources, I'll make a film for you that uses my work, but is based upon Virginia Woolf's novel Orlando, which you'll remember from whenever, 1919 or whenever it was published, in which a person who lives for some 300 years changes sex one day and passes both across continents, across time, across genders, right? And so in the film, there are all these Orlandos. And the Orlandos are all articulating various parts of the project of a kind of renegade trans community and collectivity. So I really recommend, it's going to be at Film Forum in November. You should go see it. There were some issues with it, though. Yeah.
You want to say it on camera?
No, I don't.
I just feel like I got to remind you. The last scene, which it's not giving anything away because it's not that kind of film, but is interesting, is almost this like graduation ceremony in which all of the Orlandos get a passport, the passport they want. And I think there's something also there, again, like about the bureaucratic or like the state-sanctioned way in which like that's the space of, that was one of the issues for me actually, which is like, so we're ending with this kind of legibility? That's interesting, yeah. But it has to also do with like the ability, with mobility and the ability to move, right? Yeah, go ahead.
Mm-hmm. No, there's so many places my mind is racing, but I like to talk a little bit about trans look because it seems to me, well, I'm going to let you explain your own concept, but it seems to me that the idea of getting very many perspectives, I mean, that's in Monkman's work, yeah. And it's also potentially much bigger than just gender issues, right? Because it's what we need right now in so many places in the world where people are just killing each other, right? Would you mind telling the audience who doesn't know about the term? And
yeah, I'll just say that really quickly. I mean, and again, this is like quite a while ago now. I mean, I've been doing this work on trans studies for such a long time, in fact, that the whole scene has changed in the meantime. But I did propose, about 15, 20 years ago that there is something called a trans gaze, which is, or a trans look, in which the trans person often has to inhabit several positions at the same time. Mm-hmm. You have to understand how somebody is going to see you, whether they will recognize you in your chosen gender, whether they will, as often they will read you, they will think they're reading you wrong or right, and so there's an endless kind of drama, a theater that plays out around the trans person. Hello, sir. I mean, ma'am, I'm sorry. I didn't know. I mean, right. And that occasions in response the trans person seeing from their body from multiple places at the same time. And there are a few films that I mention in relationship to that where that gaze then gets split up so that the trans gaze is literally located in several different bodies. And in Orlando, that's exactly what happens, which is what's so satisfying about the film. The meaning of transness is split across many, many different bodies to suggest that we're always moving through this gauntlet of recognition and misrecognition, and so on. But maybe we could pass that question to Meg. I mean, you are often sort of conjuring trans bodies in your work, but not explicitly. Like, it isn't, the poem is never simply about, an encounter with a trans man or something. You have many, many other kinds of cues that you use for gender queerness. And so we heard that poem about fisting. In that poem, for example, you just simply move us away from the usual scene in which there'd be two bodies that we see from the outside and we'd understand what they look like. And here we go inside, and so we're asked to think differently. And, and then the exchange is flirty about smut and so on. So I was interested in how you write about your own gender in relationship to these transing genders as well.
Yeah, that's a really great question. That's the smartest question I got about the book, because everyone's like, so it's a book of love poems. I'm like, they're actually kind of revenge poems. I don't know. So two things. One, I would say, is that there are all these kinds of like hidden, ambiguous sort of signifiers that if anybody's part of any subculture, you know, like, I don't know, my friends and I kind of know sometimes who's queer depending on like if they're wearing like 2 gold chains on like a black t-shirt. Like there are these like weird things that like are very, very local, right? And they sort of multiply, and then when they become stable, there's like a disruption. So I think that says something larger about like maybe like a subculture, right? But then like there's a poem about me meeting somebody on an airplane, and I never like fully say what the gender is of the person. But like the performances, they have like a huge giant box of cosmetics and like a studded eye mask, and they're singing Prince. They were out of their mind. Obviously, I was like in love with them. And like they were like talking about their astrology, and so like of course that person's queer. You know, they're singing Prince and they're talking about like astrology, like, and they have like an eye mask that like is bedazzled. And so there are sort of these like, they're almost like kind of fetishistic. I think you said that. But like at scale, to me, it's not interesting to really describe somebody's body because it feels violent to do that. And I think there's also something about the history of lyric poetry when like somebody was pissed off that somebody didn't love them, and then they could just like do whatever they wanted with that person, you know, like, and make critiques of them. And I think it's more interesting to be really like attentive to almost like the relationality or the context or the city or the airplane or, you know, the train or wherever it is. So there's that, right, that I feel like I'm doing. And then the second thing is like a lot of the book is just being like, I don't think couples are working. Doesn't look good. Like I don't think people not talking about not having communities larger than just the one person, it's not working. And so a lot of the poems are also like about my cousin who's a priest, I don't know, whatever. It's about family members who have to do things and live in ways which have to look one way, but then they have kind of almost these like sort of shadow lives, right? So it's like, how do you attend to a shadow life and still keep it in the shadows? It to somebody who won't be able to recognize it, but for people who maybe know a kind of subculture, that's who the poems are for, you know? Like, that's the audience of the poems. A lot of people are not going to get that. But that's also kind of about, like, how we might think about an audience, like, who we're speaking to. And in, like, the publishing industry, you know, like, there are a lot of books that are, like, very lauded for being, like, queer breakout books. But in the queer community are like, this is, like, basic. This is, like, Tuesday. This is not kink, you know? And what we are seeing is those authors who are great, I'm nothing against them, but who are being rewarded then, right? Like for explaining something to a straight, cis community of people. And so I think that's another thing that I'm never trying to write towards, because my own sexuality and my own identification are deeply ambiguous, like deeply. Like I don't ever feel like I need to tell people explain myself, because I'm like, you explain yourself. I don't know, you know?
Yeah, and there's that one poem where Meg sits down on the plane next to this woman who pulls out the big bag of makeup and is singing and then puts on the rhinestone-studded mask. The thing that Meg then concludes is that what seals the deal for why she sort of falls in love with this person without us knowing much about that gender, the gender of the person, is that it was somebody who was making a home of brevity. And that was like what really, I was like, oh yeah, that's what's so appealing and attractive, is that this person on the plane is going to make that plane ride perfect for them. I'm going to go all out in my middle seat in economy to make this work for me. And by the time you get to the end of the poem, you too are in love with this. And that's how the poems work at the kind of granular level of desire, that desire isn't what we see in the rom-com, you know, she's looking beautiful and has a dog, and then her dog plays with your dog, you know. I mean, the nonsense cliches that we give each other are not desire. This is desire. where you see someone making a home of brevity. And it's that is possible in these poems that, I mean, I just haven't seen another poetry collection personally that is so able to sort of hone in on the filaments of desire in that way.
Yeah, Irene, and this is also important, I think. She was like, come see me in Vienna. And I was like, okay. And I went to Vienna. And then she came to that reading in Berlin. She took a 12-hour train ride. And this is not a flex. I'm also just saying this as like, there's something really beautiful about in queer communities, people who really make like commitments to each other. You know, like you don't have to be related to me, or I don't have to feel like I have a filial responsibility to a person who could be like, and also stranger intimacy, deeply important, I think, right? And I think there's a way in which like promiscuity in like a lot of like queer culture or queer studies is thought of as something like cheap and small and insignificant and ephemeral. And it's like, if you have a complete reorientation to time and intimacy, those things actually really matter. That person matters. That interaction mattered.
Absolutely. So you both have us so curious now. How about if we hear the poem, Meg? Willing to read it?
Yeah. Do we have any Sagittariuses in the room?
Yes, me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, yes. All right. So if you don't know anything, are you raising your hand belatedly? You didn't want to out yourself as a Sagittarius? That's great. I love Sages. Okay, so we have two. Sagittarius, all you need to know about it is that they are born, which is important to the poem, like late November and then most of December, right? So this is important for the poem. I'm going to stand up again because it just feels weird. Okay, Sagittarius. On the plane to Zurich, you tell me you've recently moved your birthday to June. When I ask, how does one move their birthday? You say you've always felt you deserve to be born in summer. While you're talking, I can't believe my luck that we've been seated together at random since I spotted you at the gate and thought the drum in your ear was beating faster than the world. You say, I used to have psychological problems, but now that's all settled, as if you just closed a deal on a house. When you pull out a sleep mask studded in blue rhinestones and announce your bedtime routine while singing Prince and everyone in our row stares, I steady your giant box of cosmetics and think, oh my God, I'm in love with you. With anyone who can make a home of brevity or insist on a new season for their birth. Come see me in Vienna, you say. And I do, because I believe so much in being led.
Yeah.
Woo! Thank you. I also just had this thought reading this, that like that line of insisting on a new season for your birth, like that's queer, right? Like just insisting on being like, on things that are not, like things you're determined at birth will not determine you, you know? Mm-hmm. We believe in indeterminacy, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Great. So should we ask the audience what's on their minds?
Sure.
Yeah, there's one other thing we could just get to.
Absolutely.
Which, before we do that, which is Meg just gave this, proposal that one of the things that book of poems is about and that queer theory in many ways has led us to is the fact that the forms for intimacy that we've settled on, particularly the couple form, just doesn't work anymore. And that actually is the topic of the poem in the book that derives from a dinner that Meg and I had together. And at this dinner, I told her about a film I had seen. I don't know if you guys have seen this film. It's called Open Water. Has anyone seen it? It's a very bad film. And it's a kind of a B movie, but it's based on a real life thing that happened, which is that in somewhere in the Caribbean, I believe, and the film is vague about where a group go out to dive, to do scuba and other diving. And the captain of the boat incorrectly counts the people getting on and off. And he sails off and leaves this couple in the water, in the open water. And the rest of the film, and we've seen them bickering in the hotel room, we've seen all kinds of horrible interactions between them, but the holiday is for them to get back together. So here they are in the vast ocean, that boat's not coming back because the captain counted and he thinks he's right. And the question is, what will the couple form allow? Will they sustain each other? Will they die in each other's arms? Will they support each other? They fight until the bitter end, and then they both die. And I told Meg this, which I think was probably kind of a depressing note.
Yeah, I walked home after this dinner because, can I just say what you said to me?
Yeah.
We were just trying to eat a steak. Jack was like, that's because the logic of the couple is like a Beckett play, Meg. facing the end, you don't want someone with you for comfort. You want someone with you to blame. And I was like, well, I will be walking home and thinking about that all night. I told everyone I know, I was like, bro, it's like a Beckett play out here. I thought that was so brilliant.
Our poem.
All right, no, great. Well, I just think we need to hear that poem too, and then we'll open up to the
I
audience,
literally
okay?
just quoted it too, but I'm gonna.
That's
I'm
okay.
gonna. Okay,
Go
so it's
for it.
called
Go for it.
dinner. It's called Dinner with Jack.
Because I'll interject there.
Yep.
You may have quoted part of it to us, but we haven't really talked about form, right? And
Oh,
all
right.
these brilliant forms that you've come up with that also are doing work in these poems, right?
Yeah. So okay. But first, this very depressing dinner with Jack. A couple goes scuba diving and by accident get left behind in the water. The boat roars off, and there they float in full gear and disbelief, tanks low on air, stranded in a seamless blue, deciding if they can survive until the next day, which of course they cannot, because the average person can only tread 4 hours without a life jacket. The couple bicker. Why did we go on this vacation? Why did you choose this company? Why did I choose you? And even when it's too late, with fatigue building in their arms and waves bowing their bodies like a whipped dessert, they make their case of a soulmate gone wrong, because a real love story would never end like this. Eventually, the couple must choose their deaths. One removes their suit and slips into hypothermic sleep, and the other cuts and spills blood to entice a shark. Both choices tell us something about our protagonists, who are maybe not even our protagonists, since they're so bitter one cannot fully root for them. See, the logic of a couple is like a Beckett play. Facing the end, you don't want someone with you for comfort. You want someone with you to blame. Jesus, I reply, and cut my steak like a heart. So... we're going out for dinner after this. If anybody wants to join.
There will be steak.
Yeah.
Great. So we would love to hear what's on your minds. And if you could speak into the mic, that helps with the recording. We realize even if you have a big, strong voice. And I think we're open, right?
Yeah,
Like
ask anything.
Yeah. Great. I guess first question's up here. And if people could be succinct, and then we'll hear from the maximum number of people.
Well,
Thank you.
Meg started with saying something like, every poet knows that language is a failure. But you've done so well tonight. Why? Could you say more about that, I guess? Why do you think language is a failure?
Yeah, I think I say this sometimes to my students too. I think like the way that a painter knows that representation is a failure, and that you have to do something with that representation. So one thing I always think about is that like if somebody is grieving, right, they lose someone, and you say, I'm so sorry, like I know what you're going through, and you just want to murder them. They don't know what you're going through. Why would you say that, right? So there's this way in which when you're having your extreme emotions or extreme states, that language will never be able to capture that. And that's why we have poetry about grief and about love and about extreme states, because it's trying to approximate or get close to some kind of truth that really the language cannot get there. And people who do translation, they know this so well, because if you ever translated something, you gotta, I think it was like Benjamin was like, it's a house on fire. Some things gotta stay. You can't bring everything with you. Maybe you bring the rhythm of the poem, but you can't bring something else. So I always think that, and I have a friend who's like a cartoonist, and I don't know if you know this, you don't make a lot of money doing that. So he illustrates ESL textbooks. And one of the most interesting things is him having to illustrate the difference between synonyms like weeping and sobbing. And he would be like, Meg, how do I draw, like what representation of a person weeping feels like weeping versus like sobbing, or humiliation versus like embarrassment? And they have different forms of social banishment, right? So like nothing in language can really fully capture some of these places inside ourselves. And sometimes it's violent to have language, right? And people suffer for like language. So sometimes like things that are more interpretive or atmospheric, I'm more in favor of things that are trying to push at the grammar or the feeling or complicate it. I love a poem that has contradictions. But thank you for that. That's a great question.
Great. Another question or comment or thing? Yeah, go ahead, please.
So a comment and then also a question. Meg, the story and the poem that you kind of opened with kind of made me think of John Waters films. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but just kind of like the bluntness of it. So that was my comment. And then my question kind of goes off of the conversation that took place about like being, visibly queer, or what it means to like present yourself as queer, and then the comment that I believe Jack had made about kind of like projecting queer qualities onto straight people. So going off of that, can any of you sort of like elaborate on how dangerous some of the recent legislation is and how that does end up affecting other people, like even cishet people, because like we're seeing that play out with legislation that is so vague that it affects people's cancer treatments, or even seeing people be attacked and even killed because someone claimed to have clocked them as trans. So if we could elaborate on how the dangers of that kind of manifest.
Jack?
I mean, I think you've explicated that for us. What seems to be a limited bill that is trying to just manage what kids can and cannot do to their bodies in relationship to permanent change, because that's how it gets formulated, is, as you're implying, is a much bigger form of social control, because it may be like, we're going to get in the way of your trans child seeking trans-affirming care, but the larger impact is to just say, we're going to maintain the gender binary and its stability by any means necessary. And that impacts everyone. And I think that the only way forward is kind of to get people to see that these are not bills just about trans kids. If the trans kids being policed, so is the whole class that they are a part of. And that's a kind of a better strategy for counteracting these bills, many of which will not pass, but have been crafted by very conservative lawmakers, but may not pass. So we also don't want to get so exercised and give these people all that power, while recognizing that this is at least a desire to manage how kids want to be in their bodies, which is insane.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to underscore a point that Jack made earlier, because I think it's profound, which is when we're following this distraction because the people who are creating it are so loud, we are not paying attention to really major issues like genocide and the genocide of the entire planet that's happening because of what we're not attending to with climate change. So when you say so rightly, it affects all of us, it sure does, right? So if your attention's over here, it's really hard to have it over here. And as humankind, we have a lot of work to do. So thank you for saying that,
I just
Jack.
wanted
Please.
to follow up and say, like, it feels like a larger sort of biopolitics or surveillance project. Like, I know there was a bill that they were trying to pass where, like, all the women in the class had to give, like, their menstruation history, right? And so, like, it didn't pass. I think it was Florida, I think. So I think that like, those kinds of, all kinds of biopolitics and surveillance, like, we need to be worried about that. And I also think, to a larger extent, like, we probably, like, people who are in the queer community need to talk about, like, the discourse of outness, right? And, like, also that, there's something not uncomplicated there. I'm part of a South Asian diaspora. It's just a really different world, it's a really different context. And the surveillance is coming from not just the state, right? There's also the surveillance of the family or the diaspora surveillance. People you haven't talked to in like 20 years, but they're on a WhatsApp group. They know everything about your life somehow, Like there's also that too, which I think is part of what you're kind of saying also.
Okay, on a different note, I want to thank you both for a really stimulating and exciting conversation. And I do want to read more of your poems, Meg. Could you just tell us what volume you are reading from?
Oh, yeah. So this is it. It's called I Do Everything I'm Told, and it's got a bunny on it. And you can't miss it. It's neon yellow. Yeah. It's got
And
a
it's on your reading list.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. Yes, thank you so much. I think it was very interesting the way both of you were talking about desire being something, I don't know, having a specific intersection with queerness, and wanting to protect that in some ways. But I'm wondering also about if there are pieces of that you feel have ideas about how to invite people who maybe aren't in the queer community to find some part of that for themselves. Not like, is there something that queer people have to teach about desire that would help everybody get more in touch with their own needs and selves and desire?
I mean, like monogamy. I don't know. I mean, like there's a lot of work and books about like polyamory and monogamy and like different ways of having relationships, right? I think there's nothing queerer than like single mothers, to be honest. So I don't know. I have a really different, like, I think there's so many things that seem straight that are queer, like Freud. Like, everyone is, a lot of people are like, why do you like Freud? I'm like, I actually learned about Freud that he had this huge family and he had like a nanny who was the same age as his mom. And like, that kind of like is why he got really interested in like interpersonal, like family, like relationships and developments, because he just had half siblings and stuff. I don't know. Like, I think that's queer. Like, I think that anything that breaks a structure, some sort of normative structure. So like, I'm at the age right now where like my friends are ending their first marriages and we're watching how this goes. And like, so there's like, there's such a stigma. Some of them are just like the divorce, the stigma of it is so horrible. Like it's a prison and it feels so shameful. Like, anything that can alleviate shame, I think, is an opportunity to think, like, where is the shame coming from and what is it a cover for? Shame actually comes from the word shelter. I learned that recently. And so, like, it means, like, wanting shelter at the moment that you're exposed. What if you could, like, imagine a world where, like, literally coming into an exposure didn't make you want to hide, you know what I mean? Like, I don't know, like that's a very like poetic way of thinking about that, about queer, but maybe, yeah.
Well, I was just thinking, it sort of fell to queer people to theorize desire precisely because people were being marginalized and critiqued for their desire, which meant that then you have to say, well, but I don't feel like I can change this. So that then leads to these very elaborate and lush languages for desire under the heading of queer. And the reason that there isn't the same kind of experimentation under the heading of straight is because so much is sort of seen as inevitable and taken for granted about heterosexuality, which means that less needs to be explained. One of the things Meg and I were talking about before this event was that, I mean, a lot of times when queer people hook up, especially if it's like a trans person and maybe a femme person who could have heterosexual or queer relationships, you have to exchange a lot of information. It's like what kind of sex toys and what colors should they be and of what shape and of what variety. Is this acceptable? Is that acceptable? Now you see young people doing that in straight relations around the issues of consent. Nowadays, young people do have a lot of conversations that I'm willing to bet 20 years ago their counterparts did not have. Do you feel okay about this? Are you okay if we do this? How about if we do that? Right? And that's very foreign to me. That doesn't sound super sexy to me, but I want to respect the idiom that they've created to make their desire less inevitable. less inevitable. And then what really strikes me in Meg's poetry is how surprising desire becomes again through poetry. And this is what Irene was trying to get at, I think, was what is it that poetry allows? And more importantly, with Meg's work, what does the form allow that, say, a piece of prose wouldn't? And she's often using the sonnet, which we can already imagine, to twist the love sonnet into a meditation on desire, for example, is quite clever. But there are also villanelles, and there's all kinds of forms that you're using. And if you think about desire, desire is sometimes the imposition of constraint on a scenario, and it's sometimes about the loosening of constraint. And it depends. Sometimes constraint is super sexy, and sometimes it's actually the thing that needs to be removed. And I was wondering about that in relationship to poetic form, and how you see that.
Yeah, I love a sonnet. Turns out, but sonnets are asymmetrical, and that's what I think is kind of queer about the sonnet. And a good friend of mine is probably the most famous, it's probably the best reviewed book of like poetry, but also queer poetry this year. It was called Couplets by Maggie Milner, if some of you know it. It's on the reading list, and it's literally end-rhymed couplets. And I was like, girl, I don't know. And it's about leaving a relationship with a man to have this relationship with a woman, but it's kind of about the three of them in this like psychic love triangle. But turns out that like the couplet, which is a dialogue, it's a dialogic mode. There's nothing more coupley than the couplet. But then like the end rhymes are slant rhymes. So there is this kind of like asymmetry, and a slant rhyme is an almost rhyme, and most rhymes are slant. They're not always true. And when the rhymes are true, she's trying to indicate something to the reader. And when they're slant, she's trying to indicate something weird to the reader. So like most villanelles, 19 lines, most great forms of like poetry have a kind of asymmetry to them. So like the sonnet is 14 lines, but it has a sestet and a what can't I think of? An octave. So like, and the first sonnet is like a Sicilian, it was from like a Sicilian lawyer. It started out as like a documentary kind of, and then it became something else. So forms are always kind of changing, and we're sort of changing with them. And I think that poetry does it better because you don't have to care about plot or chronology. You can be like, on Jupiter, and then you can be like talking to your mom, and nobody's going to be like, what happened? I'll be like, it happened because I said it happened. There you go. Yeah. The speaker has a lot of agency.
We're starting to run out of time, and I wanted to make sure each of our speakers had a few minutes to just reflect on something they wanted to say that they maybe didn't get a chance. But I am a literature professor, so I'm going to say one more thing about form, which is, Meg, when I had the chance to just read more of your poetry or read it again in preparation for tonight, I had so much fun with enjambment. Now, those of you who haven't been in an English class or a poetry class in a while, right? Enjambment is when the idea and the punctuation doesn't end at the end of the line, but moves in. And just in terms of desire, it occurred to me with the title for tonight and rereading Meg's poems and finding those enjambments. That's what enjambment is all about, is desire. It's like, wow, where is this going? And you use it judiciously but really brilliantly. So I know Jack and I, who are already committed fans, are hoping that many of you will buy Meg's poetry and read it and get back to her about it, right? And Meg, we didn't have a chance to sell your books here tonight, but you're reading Friday. Do you want to tell people where you're reading?
I'm reading at NYU on Friday with...
is it open to the public?
It is open to the public, and it's at the Lily Vernon House on 10th Street. Yeah.
Great. What time?
I think it's kind of early. I think it's like 5 or 5:30. I should probably know that. I'll look that up. Yeah.
No, on Friday.
I'll know on Friday. Yeah, at 4 p.m. I'll know where I'm going. Yeah.
Great. So this is our last, sort of 10 minutes, and I was just wondering if each of you would enjoy taking a few minutes to maybe. I know, Jack, you had some really interesting artwork that you've been thinking about, or if there's another example you'd like to share with us.
No, in fact, I just want to sort of confirm for myself that Meg was exactly the right person for me to speak with tonight, precisely because of the difference that it makes how you say things. And, you move away from the obvious and the cliched and the sort of routine narratives about gender and the body and desire when you enter into the poetic. And so there are a few lines of Meg's that I was hoping we'd get to tonight, and that in many ways we have, and they sort of summarize, the kind of clunky contributions that I wanted to make, which is, one is, it's better to be illegible sometimes than they can't govern you, which is that's kind of a big deal in queer studies, to precisely say that, to say, visibility is a bit of a ruse. Many young people will say, well, I want to see people like me on TV or something. And the point is that being visible means that you're also available for surveillance and regulation and all of those things. Another line that's very important to the work that I'm doing right now is, and it came from the first poem that Meg read, to be taken apart is as important as being put together. To be taken apart is as important as being put together. And I am currently finishing a book about precisely that, and about how trans is not the making up of a new category, but is a taking apart of all the old categories that have made trans the problem. And when we look at things that way, and I use the example of Gordon Matta Clark, who was an artist in the 1970s in New York City, who practiced what he called anarchitecture, anarchy and architecture coming together, and he would unbuild things. And that's what I sort of want to conclude with, is the idea that we potentially have to move away from this language of being and doing and making and becoming and building, and start thinking in much more serious ways and frivolous ways about unbuilding and unmaking and unbecoming.
Thank you for that. I would say that my last thing is, and maybe this goes back to a question that was asked, is to really just build a lot of romantic friendships. And I think that it's across all genders or orientations. When we were in Berlin, as you know, we had a Q&A where the first question was, she was obviously trying to figure out if me and the poet who I was traveling with were sleeping together, and we're just homies. But it was because we had really good chemistry, and we were both cis, and he identifies as a man, and it was just interesting to be misread, to have your intimacy slightly misread. Being misread can be hot. There's something kind of, and by that I also mean having romantic friendships is also making commitments to people, traveling to see them, going to their book openings, going to their gallery openings, or whatever they're doing in their life that isn't just about them getting married and having kids, because how lame. There is something important, I think, in making commitments to more than just the people that you promise the state, or in various ways, or you promised whatever. And to me, the most important reading on this reading list is For Lovers and Fighters. It's by Dean Spade. Dean Spade is a trans activist and lawyer in San Francisco, and they said something in this that were I treat my lovers like my friends. I give them space. I allow them to have boundaries. I have reasonable expectations of them. And I treat my friends like my lovers. I make dates with them. I keep my commitments to them. I go very far to have them in my life. And for years, they wrote that when they were 23. It's an amazing essay. For years, I just had that above my bed. It's changed my life. I love my life because of that commitment. And so that's something I would end on. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about beautiful and positive ways to end this amazing conversation. I do have a few announcements. I just want everyone to feel very, very welcome to pause and talk to our wonderful speakers across the way. There's some refreshments and things to drink. So please don't run if you don't have to run. Humanities for Humans is in its second season, thanks to our wonderful sponsors. On December 7th online, so you can watch it live, there will be the topic of immigration. We're calling it World on the Move. And it's with a brilliant legal scholar from Berkeley, Catherine Abrams, and an independent scholar from Berlin called Mark Terkasides. In February, on the 21st specifically, also online, I'm really thrilled that I'll be speaking with Martha Minow, one of my heroes for many years. She's a Harvard law professor and a really wonderful public intellectual, I think we could say. And she's actually going to be speaking with the choreographer and writer Liz Lerman. And their topic will be controversy and how do we deal with controversy? And then back here in this very same space, we hope, on May 6th, we'll be here with religion professor Susanna Heschel and professor of theology Terence Johnson on the topic of religious hate and secular societies. So if you like this idea, tell your friends about it. All last season is online, and those are some amazing talks too. Please buy Meg's poetry. Buy some of the other poets. Buy some of the poets that are on this wonderful list that Meg gave us. Buy Jack's books. Look for Jack. He's here in New York, so you're really lucky. And you give a lot of lectures, is my understanding. And finally, just thank you again to all of you for being here. Let's just do the biggest round of applause that this wonderful audience can do.